Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper. The National Green Tribunal has observed that scientific segregation of COVID-19 biomedical waste is a must in order to avoid contamination, because the unscientific management of such hazardous biomedical waste can endanger public health and as well as the environment. See, biomedical waste is nothing but hazardous waste that is generated from hospitals, medical labs, diagnostic centers, etc. This includes needles, syringes, cotton swabs, PPE kits, surgical implements, surgical masks and gloves, etc. This biomedical waste generated from hospitals, medical labs and diagnostic centers contains body fluids which serve as a host for a number of infectious pathogens, and if such biomedical waste is unscientifically managed, then it could result in contamination and this could endanger public health. So by keeping the hazardous nature of biomedical waste in mind, it is absolutely essential to segregate the waste at the source itself in a scientific manner, and then the segregated waste should be handled and disposed in a scientific manner. So in order to enforce the scientific management of biomedical waste, the Ministry of Environment and Forest came out with the Biomedical Waste Management Rules in 1998. These rules were notified as per the provisions of the Environment Protection Act of 1986, and it has been subsequently replaced with the updated rules in 2016, which was again amended in 2018. These revised rules make scientific segregation mandatory at the source itself, and accordingly, this responsibility lies with the hospitals, the diagnostic centers, and the medical labs. The waste generators are expected to segregate the waste as prescribed by the rules into different color-coded bags, and later these bags are scientifically disposed either by burning them in incinerators or by burying them or by recycling them after sanitization based on the hazardous contents of these bags. The responsibility of enforcing these rules has been entrusted to the Central Pollution Control Board and the State Pollution Control Board, and accordingly, as the COVID-19 pandemic broke out earlier this year, the Central Pollution Control Board came out with a set of COVID-19 specific guidelines, which has placed additional responsibility on hospitals and diagnostic centers with regard to scientific segregation of biomedical waste. But in a recent report, the CPCB has observed gaps in compliance to these new guidelines on the part of the hospitals and diagnostic centers, and hence the National Green Tribunal has taken suo motu notice of the failure of the hospitals and diagnostic centers to scientifically segregate the COVID-19 biomedical waste as mandated by the Central Pollution Control Board. Now let's take up an article from page number 5. Julio Ribeiro has written an open letter to IPS officers criticizing police action that has led to custodial deaths and questionable encounters in the recent past. Now before we talk about the contents of this letter, first we need to understand who is Julio Ribeiro. See, Julio Ribeiro is a retired IPS officer and a former Indian diplomat who had attained a legendary cult status during his years of service. In the 1980s, he led the crackdown of the Punjab police against Khalistan terrorists, and in return, he had to survive 2 assassination attempts. Khalistani militants tried to assassinate him once in 1986 while he was still a part of Punjab police, and another attempt was made in 1991 while he was serving as India's ambassador to Romania. During his long career in the IPS, he would also go on to serve Mumbai as the Commissioner of Police, and he was also appointed as the DGP of Gujarat Police. After completing a distinguished career in the civil services, the Supreme Court appointed Julio Ribeiro as the head of the Committee on Police Reforms that it constituted in 1998. So considering his vast experience, what Mr. Julio Ribeiro says holds a lot of weight. In his open letter to IPS officers, he has pointed out that recent incidents of custodial deaths and questionable encounters is a direct outcome of the excessive politicization of our police forces. He refers to the nexus between the politicians, the police and the criminals as a 3-legged nexus through which all the 3 legs feed off each other. He points out why a few police officers develop a nexus with politicians and criminals. See, in a constitutional democracy, any police or security force is always placed under the direct command and control of the political executive. So the political executive enjoys the powers to transfer and post police officers as they like, and if this command and control structure is not well defined, then it gives scope for a lot of discretion to the political executive, and this leads to arbitrary decision making which affects the transfers and postings of police officers. This subjects the police force to the whims and fancies of the political executive, and it places them at their mercy. So in such a setup, where the political executive has been given arbitrary powers with regard to transfers and postings of police officers, a few police officers who are seeking lucrative transfers and postings, they try to please the political executive, and this pushes them to go corrupt and develop a nexus with the politicians and criminals. It is in this context that Julio Ribeiro is asking IPS officers to take up a leadership role and lead their respective forces to shake one of these legs of the three-legged nexus by upholding ethical values such as honesty, integrity, and compassion. He is asking them to lead from the front and reaffirm their commitment to constitutional values, to the principle of rule of law, and to constantly strive towards seeking truth and justice. This article also provides us an opportunity to talk a little more about the Julio Ribeiro Committee on Police Reforms. See, in order to reform India's police forces and in order to counter the excessive politicization of India's police forces, the government of India had established the National Police Commission in 1977, which was headed by Dharam Vir. So the National Police Commission is also referred to as the Dharam Vir Commission. The mandate of the National Police Commission was to suggest a series of recommendations in order to transform the police force and help the Indian police to shed its colonial hangover and turn the police force into an efficient force that is free from politicization. As per this mandate laid out in 1977, the National Police Commission came out with a set of 8 detailed reports between 1979 and 1981. But unfortunately, most of these recommendations were not implemented by the Government of India and by the state governments. The responsibility for not implementing these recommendations does not lie with the central government alone, because policing and public order happen to be state subjects as per the 7th schedule of the Indian Constitution. After nearly 2 decades of the Dharam Vir Commission, in 1998, the Supreme Court was looking at a public interest litigation dealing with police reforms, and it decided to revisit the earlier recommendations of the Dharam Vir Commission. So for this purpose, the Supreme Court constituted the Julio Ribeiro Committee in order to examine whether the earlier recommendations of the National Police Commission were still relevant and suggest suitable recommendations in order to reform India's police forces. So as mandated by the Supreme Court, the Julio Ribeiro Committee went through the 8 reports of the National Police Commission, and it came out with a set of key recommendations. It recommended the establishment of a state security commission in each state in order to oversee the performance of the police and ensure that the police force is held accountable to the law of the land. It also recommended the establishment of a district police complaints authority in order to receive complaints from the public against any incidents of police excesses, arbitrary arrests, detention, false implication in criminal cases, and more importantly, cases of custodial violence and custodial deaths. It also recommended that in every state, a police establishment board has to be constituted in order to monitor all the transfers, promotions, rewards, and punishments that are dealt out to police officers, and also to take a look at other service-related matters. The committee recommended that well-defined rules should be framed by the government on the issue of transfers, tenure of police officers, promotions, etc., and any departure by the political executive from these established norms and rules should be brought to the notice of the State Security Commission. Then the committee recommended that the DGP of a state, who is the highest ranking police officer in the state, should be selected by the Chief Minister from a panel of 3 names that are proposed by a selection committee. According to the recommendations of the Julio Ribeiro Committee, this selection committee shall be chaired by the chairman of UPSC, and the other members of the selection committee shall include the Union Home Secretary, the Director of Intelligence Bureau, the state's Chief Secretary, and the state's incumbent DGP. The committee also recommended that the selection committee shall consult with the Central Vigilance Commission before drawing up a panel of 3 officers, out of whom one of them shall be selected by the Chief Minister as the DGP of the state. So apart from clearly detailing the selection process of the DGP, the Julio Ribeiro Committee also provided for security of tenure to the DGP. It recommended that the DGP shall have a fixed tenure of 3 years. Apart from this, the committee also recommended the replacement of the Colonial Era Police Act with a new Police Act. This recommendation finally saw the light of day in 2006 when the Model Police Act was passed by the Parliament based on the recommendations of the Soli Sorabji Committee that was constituted by the Ministry of Home Affairs. But please remember that when it comes to police reforms, the centre can only pass a Model Police Act, but it is entirely up to the state to abide by the provisions of the Model Police Act. Over the years, most state governments have set up a State Security Commission and a Police Establishment Board, but the problem is they have completely altered the composition of the commission and the board in order to provide greater representation to government members as opposed to non-government members. Even with regard to the Model Police Act, most state governments have deviated from the recommendations and they have diluted the provisions of the Model Police Act, and they have completely deviated from the recommendations of expert committees such as the Dharam Vir Commission and the Julio Ribeiro Committee. Then apart from this, the Julio Ribeiro Committee reiterated that the recommendations of the National Police Commission on recruitment, training and welfare should be implemented. In this regard, it recommended the establishment of an independent police recruitment board that could carry out the recruitment of non-gazetted police officers with minimal political intervention. The committee also called for a qualitative change in training in order to improve the performance and behavior of the police forces and enhance their commitment to ethical and constitutional values. These recommendations of the National Police Commission and the Julio Ribeiro Committee served as the basis for the Supreme Court when it issued a set of 7 historic guidelines in the landmark Prakash Singh case. According to the directions of the Supreme Court, the central government and the state governments have been mandated to implement these 7 directions in order to initiate police reforms. But implementing the first 6 directives is entirely up to the state governments, and unfortunately, most states have implemented a diluted version of these recommendations of the Supreme Court. The 7th directive of the Supreme Court, which applies to the central government, has been implemented, and accordingly the centre has constituted a National Security Commission in order to shortlist candidates for appointment as chiefs of the Central Armed Police Forces. Please do not confuse the National Security Commission with the National Security Council. The National Security Council, headed by the National Security Advisor, deals with national security and diplomatic affairs, whereas the National Security Commission is responsible for shortlisting candidates for appointment as chiefs to the Central Armed Police Forces. So in this regard, the composition of the National Security Commission can be important for prelims. See, the National Security Commission is chaired by the Union Home Minister, and the members include the National Security Advisor, the Cabinet Secretary, the Union Home Secretary, and the Director of Intelligence Bureau. Now let's take up a column from page number 6, written by India's former National Security Advisor M.K. Narayanan. In this column, the writer suggests as to how India should define its counter-China policy by using the subtle tools of power. See, as the disengagement process between the Indian and Chinese troops at the disputed Galwan River Valley has run into complexities, the writer points out that the recent border tensions were a result of a well-planned and well-executed strategy of China. According to the writer, China's aggressive behavior with India over the last couple of months has destroyed all the 4 key border agreements that were signed in 93, 96, 2005 and 2013, which had provided for relative peace and stability along the Indo-China border. The writer sees this planned aggression of China as a part of its expansionist strategy, and it not only threatens Indian interests in Asia, but it also seeks to establish China as a continental power and global power by directly challenging the superpower status of the United States. So in this context, the writer lays down the foundation on which India's counter-China policy should be based upon. First and foremost, he talks about India's military strength and how this could help deter China from displaying such tactical aggression against India. See, according to the writer, India's strategic experts and the political leadership should not fall for the Western narrative, and it should not be led into believing in an imaginary threat from China. The writer points out that unlike the narrative that the Western countries are trying to push against China, China would never risk an all-out war with India, especially when the outcome of such a conflict is not guaranteed. Because China is quite well aware of India's military strengths, and more importantly, it would not wish a full-fledged conflict with India to derail its ambitious plans that have been laid out for 2025 and 2035. By these deadlines, China plans to achieve the ambitious objectives that have been laid down under its Made in China and China Standards initiative, and any full-fledged conflict with a country like India is bound to derail China's ambitious plans. Instead of risking an all-out war, China would definitely exert repeated tactical aggression along the disputed border in order to strengthen its claims and possibly settle the border dispute in its favor. According to the writer, it is this threat posed by China that India should prepare for. The writer says that India will have to carefully read Chinese intentions and not blindly follow the Western narrative, and hence he makes a case against the formation of an anti-China alliance, including India and the Western countries. But instead, to deal with this tactical threat posed by China at the border, he calls upon India to strengthen its armed forces, because there is no guarantee that other powers such as the United States would be coming to India's assistance in case of any clashes or conflict with China. So he is asking India to strengthen the war-fighting capabilities of the armed forces, especially that of the Indian Army, vis-a-vis China. Instead of just focusing on the procurement of smart and modern weapons that act as force multipliers, he is asking the Indian government to revisit the proposal to raise a dedicated mountain strike division for the Indian Army. Establishing a well-equipped and well-trained mountain strike division that is specifically trained to fight in the Himalayan heights had been proposed by the government, but later the proposal has been dropped in favor of procurement of smart and modern weapons. See, there is no doubt that such force multipliers are desperately needed as a part of the modernization drive of the Indian armed forces. But to counter a superior force such as China, India would also require strong numbers along the border, and a dedicated, well-trained, well-equipped mountain strike division can help in deterring China from reopening the border disputes time and again. Then, apart from basing its counter-China strategy on hard power such as military power, the writer is asking India to rely upon subtle tools of power such as diplomacy and soft power in order to deter China and counter Chinese aggression. He says that diplomacy is an indispensable instrument of a nation's power, and he calls upon India to make use of its diplomatic leverage in order to unleash a diplomatic offensive against the aggressive behavior of China. Basically, the writer is asking India to engage in coercive diplomacy in order to force a change in behavior on the part of China. He says that Indian diplomacy can exploit the global trend where we are witnessing widespread opposition to Chinese policies and China's expansionism. He says that India's diplomatic strategy should exploit this perception of China by the global community, and it should not only feed on this opinion, but it should actively seek to further build international opinion that seeks to clearly point out China's violation of the rules-based order. For achieving this diplomatic goal, India will not only have to seek closer relations with the United States, with European countries and Russia, but it will also have to work towards reviving its relations with the developing and underdeveloped countries of Africa and Asia that have currently been affected by China's military and economic dominance. For achieving this objective, there can be no better platform than the non-aligned movement, and therefore the writer says that instead of discarding the NAM, it is time for India to revitalize this platform, because the NAM platform has always provided India a great deal of leverage with a number of African countries and Asian countries. Then, apart from this diplomatic offensive, which can help bring out China's misbehavior, India will also have to focus on revamping its soft skills. The writer says that the Indian government should focus on overhauling and revamping its messaging and communication to both the domestic audience and as well as the external audience. By leveraging the power of social media and by seeking closer relations with neighboring countries, India will have to shape international opinion and clearly establish that while India stands for peace, it is China which is always the aggressor. Currently, India lags behind with regard to effective messaging and communication, and this has given China an unfair advantage. But if this strategy has to succeed, India will have to first repair its relations with close neighboring countries such as Nepal and as well as with other countries in the neighborhood such as Iran, because India's ties with these important countries has taken a hit over the last few months. Then if India has to base its counter-China policy on these subtle tools of power, then it should not forget to back the claims of Southeast Asian countries which have been severely affected by Chinese aggression. Until now, India has been quite open about its involvement in the Quad, and India has willingly sought a closer strategic alignment with the United States and Japan. But unfortunately, India has not done the same for small Southeast Asian countries such as Vietnam, Indonesia and Philippines. So the writer is asking India to make use of its soft power and its diplomatic leverage to provide a voice to these small Southeast Asian countries. And he is also asking India to leverage its Buddhist and civilizational heritage in order to re-establish close relations with the Dalai Lama, which India has of late neglected in the interest of not unnecessarily upsetting China. But the writer says that the time has come to abandon such an approach, and through such a comprehensive use of soft power combined with hard military power can help India deter China's tactical aggression against India. Now let's take up the practice questions for today. Which of the following statements are correct? The United States, under its Generalized System of Preferences or GSP scheme, grants preferential tariffs to imports from developing countries. India was one of the beneficiaries of this preferential treatment, but this status was recently revoked by the United States. India and US have signed a separate preferential trade agreement. Amongst the given statements, the third statement is incorrect, so option B is the right answer. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 1, India and US are coming closer towards signing a limited preferential trade agreement which seeks to offset the revocation of India's GSP status last year by the United States. Now let's take up the next practice question. The Manodarpan initiative launched recently by the HRD Ministry deals with financial incentives for schools and colleges to switch to online classes, monitoring and promoting mental health of students and other psychological aspects arising out of stressful situations such as COVID-19 and beyond, promoting yoga among students as part of a healthy lifestyle in schools and colleges, or D, no such initiative has been launched by the MHRD. The correct answer is option B. Manodarpan is an initiative of the HRD Ministry that has been launched under the Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan. The objective of this initiative is to monitor and promote the mental health of students by providing right counseling and guidance, and deal with other psychological aspects that arise out of stressful situations such as the COVID-19 pandemic. And this initiative has been designed to look beyond the pandemic and continue providing mental and psychological support to students who might be facing stressful situations. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 11, the HRD Ministry has launched a dedicated helpline and website under the Manodarpan initiative in order to promote the mental health of students. Now let's take up the next question. Which of the following statements are correct? The Global Fund for AIDS, Tuberculosis and Malaria was established in 2002 with the endorsement of the United Nations. It is headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland. It receives donations only from governments and the public sector and has prohibited private donations. Amongst the given statements, the third statement is incorrect. The Global Fund for AIDS, Tuberculosis and Malaria receives funds from private donations as well. In fact, private donors such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation happen to be one of the largest donors to this global fund, and hence option B is the right answer. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 11, vulnerable groups such as sex workers, transgenders, gay and bisexual men who are living with AIDS, they have raised a petition to the Global Fund for AIDS, Tuberculosis and Malaria because they are unable to take care of their survival needs as their livelihoods have been completely disrupted as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now let's take up a practice question from the 2016 prelims paper. Which of the following best describes the term import cover sometimes seen in the news? The correct answer is option D. It is the number of months of imports that could be paid for by a country's international reserves. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question, examine the recommendations of the Julio Ribeiro Committee on Police Reforms and the 7 directives of the Supreme Court in the Prakash Singh case. The second question, India must use the subtler tools of power that are available to it as the main planks in its counter-China policy. Analyze. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.